leadership at least the $10,000 that he vetoed in that bill. By the way, that doesn't sound like much, but in today's dollars it would be like $2 million. And they raised every penny of the $10,000. And Marvin Olasky, in one of his books, the one that his title I forget, but it analyzes a number of presidents, he says that the total amount of private charity raised for those drought-stricken farmers turned out to be more than 10 times what Cleveland vetoed. And none of it had to be routed through a federal bureaucracy, all done privately. In 1888, with re-election looming, he wanted to make lower tariffs a big issue. Back in those days, pre-income tax days, the tariff was the main source of federal revenue. And so if you are for lower taxes, you have to come around to supporting lower tariffs. Well, that's what he wanted to do, and yet he had some aides who came to him and said, it's too hot of an issue, that you'll lose the Northeast if you do. And in more than one of the biographies about him, this discussion with his cabinet, or whoever was his aides, is recounted, in which he lectures them about the importance of leadership, defined as telling the people where you stand and letting them choose. So he's basically saying, I'm for free trade, I'm not going to hide it, I'm going to tell people. They can pick me if that's where they are, and if they're with the other guy, I have other things to do. So he made it very plain that he was going to tell the country where he stood. He already had, but he wanted to reinforce it and try to make it a key issue. His aides were right in the sense that he lost the election, but again, only in the Electoral College, not in the popular vote. And so he lost to Benjamin Harrison of the Republican Party, who turned out to be one of our worst presidents. In the next 4 years, 1889 to 93, with Harrison in office, we get what the history books refer to as the $1 billion Congress. That's what it was referred to as by ordinary Americans at the time, in a very disparaging way. It was the first Congress, run by Republicans at that time, that spent $1 billion in 2 years' time. About $500 million back to back. Now think of that, even before you adjust for, even without adjusting for inflation, the difference here is massive, isn't it? It took Congress 2 years back in the early 1890s to spend $1 billion. And that was a scandal. That was scandalous. In fact, the Republicans lost 90 seats in the 1890 election as a result of the 1888 to 1890 spending spree that they had gone on. The American people were really up in arms about this $1 billion Congress. Now, we spend about $1 billion, I think it works out to about every hour. Every hour. It took them 2 years to do it in the early 1890s. Well, and Harrison also, by the way, is a very staunch protectionist. He raises tariffs. We get the highest tariff rate in American history up to that point with the McKinley tariff of 1890. And he signs into law this legislation that has the federal government buying up almost the entire output of American silver mines. The theory here was that, well, if we infuse the economy with more money, at first they thought about doing it in more greenbacks, but then enough people were burned by that during the Civil War, they said, no, you got to be backed by something. So they said, well, let's make it backed by silver. And so they passed a law that obligated the federal government to buy up almost the entire output of American silver mines, 4.5 million ounces of silver every month, minted against gold at 16 to 1. How many of you have heard that famous ratio, 16 to 1? Even though at that time in the free marketplace, that overvalued silver by a factor of 2. In the free market, silver was worth half that. The real ratio was about 30 to 1, 30 ounces of silver to 1 ounce of gold. Now you've got the federal government buying it all up and offering to redeem it at twice the price in terms of gold. What do you think this is going to do to the Treasury's gold supply that backs our paper money? Yeah, everybody's going to run to the Treasury and say, hey, give me this, I can get twice here than I can in the marketplace. Give me your gold. So there's a drain on the gold reserve, which which in time will threaten the redemption of our paper money. At the same time, they're flooding the economy with both paper and new silver dollars. If you look at the silver dollars you might still have at home somewhere, you probably have a batch from the 1920s when there was a reauthorization, and probably some right after 1890, minted under this Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890. All of this comes under Benjamin Harrison. In 1892, Grover Cleveland comes out of retirement and says, we got to put a stop to this. Runs and beats Harrison and becomes president once again. But what a terrible time to take the office. Back in those days, they took office in March 4, not January 20th. And the economy, feeling the heat of this reckless monetary policy, begins to slide into recession between the election and Cleveland's inauguration. There's a panic on Wall Street beginning in January, accelerating in February. The gold reserve is dropping fast, and people are worried about, is the dollar going to be safe? Foreigners start withdrawing their capital from the United States, fearing what the monetary policy might do to our money. Cleveland takes office with the gold reserve barely above the bare minimum to protect the redemption of our paper, and realizes that we've got to do something to shore that up. We've got to get rid of this Sherman Silver Purchase Act. And in June of 1893, with the panic of 1893 in full swing, 16% unemployment already, depression on our hands, Cleveland is about to call the Congress into session to get rid of the Sherman Act when he notices, well, he'd noticed this before, but it became a problem when he noticed the bump on his upper palate in his mouth. And he sees his doctor, and they diagnose it as malignant cancer. And the tumor must come out. And keep in mind, the country's in a panic to begin with. And you've got a vice president who would be a disaster if he ever were to take office. Back in those days, the president often didn't pick the running mate. That was left to the conventions, and they picked somebody for geographical balance, sometimes ideological balance. The man who was Cleveland's vice president in the second term was one of these silverite inflationist types. Didn't want to repeal the Sherman Act. Believed in paper inflation and silver inflation. His name was Adlai Stevenson, the grandfather of the Adlai Stevenson of the 1960s, 50s and 60s. And he was governor of Illinois. So Cleveland has to get this health problem dealt with. We can't have Adlai Stevenson in the White House. He's not of the right frame of mind to solve the problem. So he decides to wait on calling the Congress into special session and get this operation done. And the only reason we know anything about what happened was that years later, after Cleveland died, the doctors who did this operation wrote this up and told the story. The country just thought the president was out of pocket, not feeling well for a time. It was summer anyway, and didn't raise a big fuss about it. They went onto a yacht. You wouldn't think of going onto a boat, would you, for a delicate operation like this at a time when anesthesia was still in its infancy. They went on a yacht on the East River in New York, where they strapped the president down and gave him anesthesia, ether I think it was, and they went in and took out much of his upper palate, went up there, took out the tumor, which by the way you can see to this day. I kid you not, in the Mutter Museum of Medical Oddities in Philadelphia, they have Grover Cleveland's tumor in a jar. You can see it now all these years later. But they took it out and fitted it with a prosthetic, vulcanized rubber, and did such a great job of it that in early August he called the Congress back into session and nobody was the wiser. And then he had to fight a horrific battle to turn the Congress around.